Hello and welcome to another CG Cookie live stream. I'm Jonathan Lampel, and today we're going to be looking at the new version Blender 2.81 that's going to come out pretty soon. It was going to come out next week, so I wanted to schedule the stream for today, but it looks like, based on the developer meeting notes, that they're actually pushing it out another week. So you have a little bit more time, but I want to have the chance now to dive into all the new features and stuff because there's a lot of exciting stuff. Some of it's just little nice to have kind of tweaks here and there, but some of them are actual like workflow changers, and so it's good to be like aware of them and keep up on the differences before you download them and start using them in your own projects. So thanks for tuning in. If you're here live, say hi in the chat, and if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. That's what the stream is for. And if you're not watching this live, if you're watching this later, I'll also have a blog post with all of this stuff written down in case you want like a shortened, concise version of it. You can find that on the cgcookie.com blog. But let's go ahead and dive right into a lot of these new features. There's quite a few to talk about, starting with just the basic interface. The big thing that is, well, it's actually physically very small, but has a huge impact on just like quality of life, is the improvements to the outliner. So traditionally in Blender, the outliner has just been this like list of objects, but it wasn't really that useful for manipulating or organizing your scene. But now with a few of the new changes, thanks to Nathan Craddock and his Google Summer of Code, we can now like manipulate objects and reorganize stuff so much easier. First thing is that selection is synced now between the 3D view and the outliner. So if you select something in the 3D view, it's going to be selected in the outliner. I guess this one's a little bit hidden because it's underneath, it's parented to the rig, but you can see as soon as we select this stuff, it gets highlighted in the outliner and it's selected, and we can do that with any of these different objects. And as soon as we select something in the outliner, it gets selected in the 3D view. Pretty intuitive, and you would assume this has been the way it has always worked, but it wasn't quite like that in the past, and it could get a little bit confusing. So it's just super nice to be able to just select something and know that it's selected everywhere. And that happens similarly when you shift select something. So another change is that when you shift select something, it's going to select everything between the original selection and the new one. So if I select this sun lamp here in the outliner, and then shift select the camera, it'll select the plane too because it's in between. And this is how you'd expect to select things in like a list, similar to any file browser or any list of things that you're used to. It didn't work like that before because in 3D view, if you shift select something, it adds or subtracts from the selection. But in the outliner now it works more like a normal file browser. So we can just select all of this stuff if we want to, just by selecting one thing, shift selecting the bottom thing, and it'll go through everything in between. That's super helpful because sometimes we have really long lists of stuff. For example, I have all of these widgets here that are just for the rig, and I can just select the top one, scroll all the way to the bottom, and shift select the bottom one. And that simple action we couldn't do before in Blender 2.80, and now we can. So that's super helpful. You can also use Control to deselect things or select extra things and just add or subtract to that selection, again, just like you would in a normal file browser. So far, super useful. You can also box select stuff, which before you couldn't do that. I mean, you could, but you'd have to hit the B key and whatever. Now you can just click and drag from anywhere. And you can also, another thing, is click and drag on these little arrows and expand or contract all of them at once, which is very handy. So all of these are like pretty small things, but they really add up to just making it much easier to use. You can use the arrow keys up and down to like select above and below, which is pretty cool. And let's see, what was the other thing that was really handy? Oh, you can parent stuff in the outliner now. So if we wanted to, for example, parent the camera, the plane, and the sun all to the character, then we could shift select and use that expanded selection, but then we can find our character here under the rig, and if we click and drag, we can drag and drop that by holding shift onto the object we want to parent it to, and it'll parent it to it just like that. So now if we select the character or select the rig that the character is connected to, it should move everything. That looks pretty weird because the control rig is the one that's controlling it, but you get the idea. So that's super handy. And if you want to unparent those things, then we can select them and then shift and drag and drop them outside of that object to clear that parent. So it's really easy to organize your scenes now with the outliner. I know, right? He sheds a tear from happiness. Yeah, so now it's like all the stuff that we like really wanted before has just all been implemented all in one go. So again, thanks to Nathan Craddock for a super awesome Google Summer of Code project that implemented basically all of that right in a couple months. So another thing that goes along with the interface that is probably less flashy but definitely useful in certain circumstances is batch rename. So you can do this with F2, the hotkey F2, to rename something. So let's say I want to rename this plane ground instead of having it be its default name. So I can just hit F2 and rename that right here. So let's call it ground. That's pretty cool. But if we select multiple objects, then F2 is just gonna name the active one. But if we use Alt F2, then it's gonna bring up this really cool menu, or maybe it's Control F2. Yep, they switched it to Control F2. If we use that, then it's gonna bring up this batch rename, and it has a ton of options that we can use to rename a whole bunch of things at once. So let's do that with these widgets because there's just so many of them, and they all have the like widget at the beginning. So let's shift select all of them here, Control F2, and we can do like a find and replace or something. So let's say instead of the abbreviation WDGT, we want to actually spell out the word widget. So what we can do is just make sure it's selected, find and replace. There's a whole bunch of different options that you can use if you want to add stuff to the beginning, add stuff to the end, whatever. But you can, let's replace WDGT with lowercase widget and click case sensitive, click OK, and now all of those things have been renamed all at once. This is super, super helpful, especially if you have like a rig that has like _R and _L, but maybe you want to change it to .L and .R for whatever reason. That's what you've been using in all of your projects. Now you can do that all in one go without having to like manually rename all of them or even use Python. So again, Control F2, super helpful. I'll be using that in the future. Yeah, exactly. It may not be a huge feature, but something you'll use all the time. Absolutely. So, okay, there's another one of those things that's kind of a small feature that I think is super helpful, but unfortunately I can't access it because I'm on Windows. But if anybody's familiar with the emulate middle mouse button, it's a really handy feature that allows you to navigate without using a middle mouse. So for example, if I'm on a tablet like this, I can hold the Alt key and just drag in and orbit around the view. And so that's really handy if I'm on a laptop or something, and allows you to navigate with just a simple mouse or a tablet. But the problem with that is if I have that option enabled, then it's going to override some other settings. So normally you can do like multiple things or do the same thing to multiple objects by holding Alt in the properties. So if we go to, like, for example, viewport display, and we wanted to switch the display from textured to wire, normally I'd hold down Alt and click, but you can see that it's bringing up the navigation little thing and it won't let me actually click on this option. And so that kind of is a bummer, and it just stops you from doing it. So often if I have this on, I have to go turn it off, do the action, and turn it back on, and it's a huge hassle. Now for Mac and Linux, you can use the OS key. There's a little option in the settings, again I can't show it to you because I'm on Windows, that allows you to use your OS key as the shortcut instead of Alt. And so I'd recommend turning that on if you have it, but because the Windows key just brings up the start menu and it has its own shortcuts that you can't override as far as I know, or maybe you can, but it's a little bit extra work, it's just not available there. So that's something that's super helpful, but unfortunately I can't use it quite yet. But I think that's all for the user interface. Oh, file browser. I almost forgot the file browser. So this is another one of those things that, again, not super sexy, but once you open it up, you're like, oh man, that's so much better. So if we go to, let's say we want to import a new object. If we go to File and Import, we can just choose one of these. Then we're going to bring up a new file browser. It opens in its new window now. It's not going to take over your scene and like stop your preview rendering and all that stuff. You can just open it up and import your stuff, close it, and get back to whatever you were doing. So a lot nicer. It's been redesigned, has a much more intuitive layout. And let's actually open something up instead of that, or let's maybe import a texture or something, just so we can actually see what it looks like with a bunch of different files here. Okay, so by default, it's in like this grid layout. You can change that here, but blend files all have their own like preview images that's kind of saved. It's like a just a viewport capture right before you save the file, so you can actually see what's going on. These are all spheres, so nothing too interesting here. But I don't know if I have a better example here. Well, I guess this one you can kind of see the preview of what's in the file, but you can also change that up here as like a vertical list, horizontal list, thumbnails, whatever. And there's also your options here in the settings. But most importantly, it just has a much better layout with the address at the top. You can search to filter stuff, and you can click open and cancel whatever here on the bottom as a normal file browser does. So it's very intuitive, nothing like crazy they have to be aware of, other than if you're looking for the settings and you can't find them that used to be on the bottom left. They're in the sidebar now that you can either hit N or use its little gear icon to toggle those. So another one of those, just nice to haves. That's super handy, and I'll be definitely thankful for that going forward, so we don't have the other file browser just hijacking whatever you're working on. So after that, those are already like some pretty great updates, but there's also some modeling updates too that I'd like to get into. Let's hide these rigs and stuff. Okay, so modeling. First is the polybuild tool. Now I don't remember if this was in 2.80 or not, but if it was, it's gotten a update. So if we go into edit mode on any mesh here, we have a new tool, polybuild, and now that I think about it, it was in 2.8, but now it just has some new features. So this allows you to do a couple things. You can just build new topology just by clicking and dragging on any of these edges, which is pretty neat. If you hold Control, you can create new points, just like this. And it's really good for retopology, so you can quickly kind of rough out some shapes here. So if you don't use Control, you just click and drag, it'll drag out edges. If you use Control, it'll make triangles. And if you want them to stay triangles, there's an option for that. Under Options, just uncheck Create Quads, and then it'll stay as triangles. But normally I think you'd want that on most of the time. And then you can also use Shift, left click, and just kind of delete faces as you go. So this is a pretty cool tool. I think it's one of those that is still very early on in its development, and so it's probably pretty helpful here and there. You can click and drag on points to move them around, so you can definitely tell that it's geared towards retopology. And I think it's still pretty early on. It's after having used RetopFlow's like tweak tool, it still feels like pretty basic, but it's definitely a good thing to have in just default Blender. And I'm looking forward to seeing how it improves in the future. But combine that with snapping and stuff, and it's a pretty good start to a better retopology workflow. Now, one of the things that everybody's talking about so far is the retopology, like remesh for like automatic retopology. Now, there's a caveat there in the fact that it's not like meant for retopology itself, but there's a couple different uses for it, and there's two different types of remeshers that we get with Blender 2.81. Let me just make sure that we don't have any questions. Yeah, hello everybody that just joined, welcome. So let's look at remeshing. I have this sculpted little orb here that we used way back in the fundamentals of Blender, which by the way are in the process of being updated. But we have this sculpted little orb, and I'd like to remesh it. So we have a couple different options for doing so. We can find that in the object data tab here. And under remesh, we have voxel and we have quad. So let's look at voxel first. You have the voxel size and a whole bunch of these different options. Normally I leave on fixed polls and smooth normals depending on whether you want it to be smooth or flat shaded. Really the main thing here is the voxel size. So if we leave it at the default 0.1, it's going to be quite big, but it's also very, very fast. So the advantage of this is that it's really quick. Even with a much larger size, say I point at 0.05, you can click voxel remesh, and it'll take a second, but it'll remesh that pretty quick. And it does give you a all quad result, which is really nice. If you don't check fix polls, then you're going to get a slightly messier mesh that'll be a little bit harder to work with. But again, if you're just doing this for sculpting, not using fixed polls will take less time to do because there's just less operations that need to happen. But you still get this all quad mesh that's good for sculpting. And that's the main point here, is that this is intended to be kind of a alternative workflow to dynamic topology, where instead of just adding detail on the fly, you could say, if we go to, well, let's just go to edit mode here. Let's not even, oh, and we got a crash. All right, let's not get into sculpting stuff too soon. I think that was the first crash that I got all day, so I think that's bound to happen whenever you stream something. And I think we have a couple questions, so let me take the time to answer those while we're at it. Excuse me. Do we have the voxel as a remesher yet? Because you have great fun with that. Yep, just talked about that. Oh, as a modifier. Nope, it's not as a modifier at the time. I think that would be a pretty good idea though, because it is quite fast. It's still kind of slow. I don't know how that would work, but it'd definitely be fun to play around with. That's for sure. Okay, let's get back to that file. Let's head back to that orb. And let's remesh it again. Under remesh, voxel. I'll just do 0.1 just so that it's quick. And there we go. Oh yeah, what I was going to show is that this is really good for if you have separate things, like say for example we have a cube here that we want to attach to this. You can just smash a bunch of stuff together. So we have a cube here, let's add a sphere, all the stuff that's like intersecting, and you want to be able to sculpt on it as if it's one surface, but you don't want to like boolean it because that's a lot of work and it's probably really slow. Let's just take a monkey too, something that's not even a manifold mesh, and just stick all these things together. And let me actually duplicate this orb for later use in case we need it, so I don't completely destroy it. But let's take all of these things, Control J to make them one object so that they all get remeshed together. And let's go 0.01, so it might take a little bit longer, but we'll actually get to see how it handles some of these details here. And click voxel remesh. Cross our fingers, and there we go. So it's given us a pretty dense mesh here that we can use for sculpting. It's joined all of these objects together, as you can see from the inside, so it's combined them all so that we can start sculpting on these things. And you can see that there's a smooth transition between the two, and it all works. So this is really, really good for just kind of bashing parts together and then sculpting on top of them to make either like characters or whatever you want to do. So that's really nice, and it's available also in sculpt mode. So if you go to sculpt mode here, and actually let's go to our sculpting layout or workspace. So I have these options at the top. There's a remesh drop down here for voxel remesh. So you can do that from within sculpt mode. There's also a hotkey for it, which I don't remember offhand. Oh, it shows us right here, Control R. So you can be sculpting away. Let's say you use the grab brush here, and you pull this way over here. And also, you might notice that there's a new sculpt like cursor and stuff. That looks way nicer. There's a little dot that follows you along. It shows mirror, which we don't really need mirror on right now. That doesn't make any sense. But let's say you're working here and you pull this out until the geometry is like really, really stretched. Let's just make it really bad. Okay, that's about as bad as you can get. Now, since there's not much volume here, I don't know exactly what the remesh is going to do to it, but suffice to say it's very stretched out. Okay, so if we go and remesh this, Control R, it'll take a second, but then it's going to remesh with that. So you can now go through and sculpt this, smooth it out, whatever you want to do, and it's just a pretty quick workflow. So it's basically an alternative to dynamic retopology sculpting. Both have their pros and cons. Personally, I think dynamic retopology is easier to work with. There's just less things to think about, but at the same time, this is actually faster in terms of how long it takes to compute the mesh. Like, this can handle more polygons than dynamic retopology can, just because of the way that it works. And Pablo, the developer, has a really good Blender conference talk that you can check out. Somebody said in the chat that there's a good talk by Julian about how his workflow has changed since these tools have been introduced. I haven't watched that yet, but if you're interested in sculpting tools, then this is a good idea. And I should probably stop here before these shapes get too ridiculous, so I'm going to go ahead and delete that. But that's also pretty awesome. So, but in addition to the voxel remesh that's intended for just retopologizing as you're sculpting and going along, again, very similar to kind of the ZBrush workflow, as Silent Heart mentioned in the chat. Panway said, I used to do that with like 4 booleans, and half the time it would crash or make a right mess. Yep, absolutely. It would just, sometimes it would work, but it was very hard to do. So this makes that process a whole lot easier. But there's also a quad mesh remesh that also works pretty well. You can click remesh, it's over here, and this is not used for sculpting. This is used for after you're finished sculpting and you're ready to move on to the next thing. It's not good enough to be a like automatic retopology tool because it's just not quite there yet, and you'll see with the result here. But it does try to follow the curvature of the mesh, and it does a much better job. And for the most part, it's pretty cool. If I was doing something like taking scans of like rocks or something, and I needed to put them into a game, something that's not organic, doesn't need to have like exact edges, then I think this would be a great option. However, for things that need to have really precise geometry, you can see that this doesn't quite cut it. So this is a pretty good result. It's certainly way better than we had before, and it's pretty reasonably fast. But I wouldn't use this for actual retopology unless it's, again, something that's kind of like just a static object that just needs to be reasonably close but doesn't have to be exact. Now there is another option here that you can get as an add-on, and it's called Quad Remesher Auto Retopologizer. I don't know if that's the exact name or just the name of the Blender artist thread. Quad Remesher, here we go. And there's a picture of a comparison that somebody just posted recently that I think is pretty good. So it shows the voxel remesh back here. You can see that it's not intended to do this sort of like good topology stuff. It's just supposed to be quick and dirty, and you can see that it's definitely kind of lumpy. Quadraflow does a much better job at holding those details, but at a lower face count. But it's still a little bit lumpy. This add-on does a heck of a lot better job. I haven't tried it out yet. I'd like to, but just know that that's an option. And it's actually made by the same developer who originally wrote the code for the ZBrush remesher, and so it's really, really high quality. And you can see like the loops around his fingers and going around his face is just top notch. So if you're really into the like automatic retopology, then I'd give that a shot. But beyond that, there are also just more general modeling improvements that are pretty cool that I think are good to look at. So let's add a cube here, and let's look at some snapping improvements. actually before that, there are also some transform options that are new, which are pretty cool. If we go to our tool here, under options, we have a new effect only, origins, locations, and parents. And the effect only origins used to be under here, under the pivot point popover. Say that 5 times fast. But it's been moved because it doesn't necessarily have to do with the pivot point, or it doesn't have to do with moving the pivot point. So if we, actually let's enable our move gizmo, and if we choose origins, then we can just hit G, move this around, and now we can move the origin just by itself, which is really nice. And I did a video a little while ago showing an add-on that did this, but this works a whole lot cleaner and just works in much more cases. So you can rotate it, you can do whatever you want, and there's a nice little axis here that shows you exactly which way it's pointing, and it's really, really nice. What's cool about this is you can also snap it. So if we switch to vertex snapping, we can do that. Alt-R will clear rotation, but it doesn't quite work as you'd expect. But yeah, you can rotate it, do whatever you want. So this is really, really nice. You don't have to go into edit mode in order to like place the cursor and whatnot. That was a huge hassle. Now we can just move it really easily. Now, we can also affect only locations, which is something that we could do before already. So if we select 2 of these and affect only locations, of course, if we hit G to translate, again, that's by definition only translating the location. So nothing new there. But if we hit R, you can see that we'll move the origins, but we're not actually rotating the objects. So we're rotating the center of the objects around each other, but not the objects themselves. So if we affect only locations, we can do cool effects like this, or scale it up and just separate them without actually scaling up the objects themselves. So definitely useful and pretty cool. And of course you can, combine these 2 together if you want. So that's really nice. And also, affect only parents is really cool. So let's say we have a bunch of different objects here, and let's parent them all to this cube. In the outliner, I'll shift, click, and drag just because it's fun and new. But now when we move this cube, it'll move everything else. Now the problem with that is sometimes when you're like, really, you have a lot of children or whatever, and you realize, oh, I want this to rotate, but I don't want to rotate it for all of the children. So you could do that in edit mode, but then it gets really messy. You've kind of messed up your local rotations, and it gets a little bit hairy. So now what you can do is affect only parents, and now you can move the parent without affecting the kids. And this is really, really handy when you get into a tight spot and you just figured out that, oh, you need to move this up slightly. Now you can. You can rotate it, scale it, do whatever you want, and then uncheck that, and everything will be back to normal. So really, really nice, super helpful, and definitely something that, again, isn't something you probably use a lot, but when you do need it, it'll be very useful, and you'll be happy that it's there. So, okay, we were going to look at snapping next. And there's just a couple new options here, nothing crazy. But let's go into edit mode, select some faces, and I'm going to extrude and inset, just so we have enough geometry to actually look at. Okay, so if we go to our snapping options, we can turn that on. We have 2 new things. We have edge center and edge perpendicular. So before, if we had just edge, we could take this vertex and just snap it to any edge, but we couldn't get right into the middle of that edge. But now, if we choose edge center, it'll only snap to the center of that edge. So exactly as it sounds, pretty intuitive, but it's definitely very handy for like precision type stuff. So that's a nice option. And there's also edge perpendicular, which snaps to an edge without without like skewing it. So let's see if we have a good example here. Okay, so let's say we want to snap this vertex to this edge, but we want to keep the line on the right of it straight. Well, we could either hold along the x-axis and then hold control and snap to that edge as before, or if for some reason it's like rotated weird, the like the orientation axis or whatever isn't quite lining up, then you can switch this over to edge perpendicular. Just hit G, and it should find that as you hover around. I'm really not finding that here. I literally just tested this and it worked. Let's see. It's project onto self, snap with closest center. Maybe it has to be set to center. But either way, you'll get this little X where it started from, and you can see that it keeps that line that's next to it parallel. So the line on the x-axis here has still been kept straight. Yeah, I think it's still a little bit funny. Oh, there we go. So it's not always obvious what it will and won't snap to, I guess. But overall, a nice addition. Yeah, I think that was just a user error, but I feel like it should snap with closest as well, but that doesn't seem to be the case. But all of the other ones, it seems to work. So again, nice option that it's there. Okay. There's also a new option for when you auto merge stuff, but to be completely honest, I haven't figured out what it does. And I found this in the release notes, and it looks cool, but the picture that they used to describe it is not clear whatsoever. And I messed around with it for quite a while, and I actually don't know what it does. So if you happen to know, let me know in the chat or in the comments below if you're watching this later, because I'm pretty curious. If you go to Tool and Options, there's Auto Merge, and what that does is, let's say we have snapping enabled, and we're just going to merge a bunch of vertices. Let's say we want to get rid of all this stuff at the top. We can just hit G, hover over, and move these over. But instead of creating doubles as would normally happen, these are just automatically joined into one vertex. So that's always been kind of a nice option, but not something you want to leave on all the time, because you can definitely make a mess accidentally. But there's a new option here for split edges and faces that apparently splits edges and faces. But I haven't actually found a way in which it does anything different than what I would expect. If you do something like that, then these are already two different faces, whether that's on or off. Maybe it's for... Yeah, I actually don't know in what use case this is helpful. So if you happen to know, let me know in the chat. But I just think it's funny that there are just some things that I'll find like, oh, that seems cool. I'll play around with it and realize I have no idea what this does. So even after many years of using Blender, there are always things like that. So if you run into that type of situation, don't feel bad, because that happens to literally everybody. I think it goes together with snap to middle of edge. So we go to edge center. But if you snap to a middle of an edge, then you're not snapping to a vertex, so there'd be nothing to auto merge. So I don't think it's that. Well, okay, well, we'll figure it out eventually. And if I do figure it out, I'll let you know in the blog post that we'll post right when Blender 2.81 is officially released, and that'll have all the details there. But let's look at some of the different sculpting stuff. Again, I'm not really a sculptor. Kent does all of the sculpting here, and by the way, if you've seen his like écorché stuff, it's looking really cool. It's like a skull with these different muscles and different like areas of fat, and they're all like labeled and looks super cool. And definitely be on the lookout for that type of info. I won't say exactly what he's working on, but it's pretty darn awesome. So if we want to talk sculpting, talk to Kent. However, I can look at just some of these different brushes and see how they go. So let's see, we already looked at the sculpt cursor a little bit. Let's jump into sculpt mode or our sculpting editor here, and we saw how the brush kind of like previews the symmetry with this little dot, and that's pretty cool. But also with a grab brush, you can be a little bit more precise with this option for grab active vertex. I guess I don't need two different tool shelves here. There we go. Grab active vertex, and if we zoom in really, really far, you can see that this little point is going to jump to the nearest vertex, and it's better for like lower poly stuff where you need to be a little bit more precise. So if we don't have this on, you can see that I guess it does still jump, but the actual grab function isn't centered around that little dot. So that's a nice addition. There's also a thing called auto masking or topology auto masking, which is pretty sweet. So if we have a sphere here, let's just use a really contrived example. But if we put that over here, and let me turn off snapping. There we go. Let's join these two together. And let's say I'm over here sculpting and I want to grab, and I want to move this part of the sphere out a little bit. Well, it's going to grab the orb as well. And you can see here where the grab active vertex actually is pretty useful. On this lower poly thing, you can tell a little bit more what it's doing. But if we grab this, it's going to grab both, and you don't always want that, especially if you have like a character and the character has eyes and all these different parts. Then it can be kind of frustrating, and you have to like hide stuff, mask it, whatever. But now if you go to options and topology auto masking, then ooh, look at that. You can just go ahead and grab part of the sphere without messing up the other stuff around it. So it just only manipulates the connected portions. So that is very, very cool. And I believe it works with other brushes as well. So even with like clay strips, I can go ahead and sculpt on this without messing up the sphere that's next to it. So pretty awesome. There's also a thing called dynamic mesh preview, which you have to have a modifier enabled. So let's go back to our layout here, and let's add something low poly like an icosphere, and let's do something that you should probably never do, and that is add a subdivision surface modifier and then start sculpting on that. So not something you really want to do, but if for whatever reason you have a modifier and you're using the grab brush, then it'll show you the topology that's underneath the brush. So that's super cool. This is a pretty niche thing because I don't know exactly why you'd be doing this, but it's pretty neat. But if you don't have a modifier, then there's no need to do it. And if you're using a different brush, then it doesn't show. So it's like a very, very niche thing. But it looks cool, so that's cool. There's lots of other stuff like new tools, pose brush, transform tool. I guess let's look at the pose brush. Let's make a fake arm here. And apologies for the super simple examples, but I am not the sculpting guy. So let's just like subdivide this. Okay, so we have this pretend arm, and if we go to sculpt mode, we can use the pose brush, and it's going to try to guess where the joints are. So this doesn't use IK, there's no bones here, there's nothing, but you can still use this and kind of, oh geez, let's turn off mirroring. And you can see we can take this and just kind of pose it around. So it's fun to play with. It's mostly used for if you are sculpting like fingers and something and you need character to be like grabbing an object. You can move it around, twist it, and it's very, very simple. Like, it just kind of intuitively knows what it is that you're trying to do. Can be a little bit off sometimes, but especially if you mask stuff first, then it could work really well. So if you kind of mask all this stuff out and you only want to move the end, then you can move everything except that. And in that case, you can get a little bit more precise with it, which is pretty cool. So that's a very handy brush. But you can also just move stuff in general in sculpt mode now, which is very new. There's now just move, rotate, and scale. So you can take this and just move it to the side. Or you can say you want to mask something out and move that. Then, so you can mask this, and I think it's Control-I to invert the mask. Take the move tool and move that. So with the move tool, the rotate tool, and all of the new masking stuff, sculpting should be quite a bit easier and should be pretty fun. A couple people lost the stream. Shoot, let me just make sure that it's live here, and seems to be going through on my end. So let me know if that continues to happen. But it seems to be back for everybody. Okay, cool. That must have been my internet jumping out or something. But if you missed something in particular that you wanted to see, let me know. But I was just going over basic new sculpting stuff. There's a bunch of different options. There's another mesh filter tool, which is nice. Let's go ahead and clear this mask. Mesh filter, and it applies a effect over the entire mesh. So it has a bunch of different options for either inflate or scale or whatever. There's a texture one that's coming that looks really cool. Sphere, that's kind of nice. So you just click and drag and it'll apply the filter, whatever it is, to the entire mesh. So yeah, also a new Draw Sharp brush that just has a much more improved, wow, my English is going out the window. It just has a much better algorithm for drawing sharp stuff. The example in the documentation is for like wrinkles on clothes and whatnot, especially if you use the sharper fall-offs, like so. Woo. That'll give you a bit better than just a regular draw brush. You can see the difference. One looks sharper than the other. So it gives you better creases without actually pinching the topology together. So there's a few extra things with Sculpt as well. If you want to see those, they'll be either in the article or will be posted by somebody who knows more about sculpting than I do. What I do know more about is shading and rendering, though, and there's a lot of new stuff there too, especially from the Google Summer of Code by Omar, who updated a bunch of nodes. So let's look at that. I have this shader example here. If we switch to our shading workspace, here I have an example of all of the new and updated nodes. So there's not a ton, but they add quite a bit of functionality just with these few. So with new, we have volume info. So instead of having to go through the custom data and like inputting the exact name and hoping you don't spell it wrong and all that stuff, now we just have a volume info node with the color, density, flame, and temperature, generally used for smoke simulations. So you can just plug this straight into a volume principled shader and you're up and running right away. So that's super cool. There's a new white noise texture, which we can look at this. But actually, you really won't be able to see it too much, because if we click on it, it just looks like it's kind of white, but a little bit off-white. But what it is doing is, on a very, very small level, like, you know, each like individual pixel has a random value. And so you can't see it on this large scale, but if you need to input random values for stuff, you can use this white noise texture, and it'll give you a much more true random result, because there's just a tiny amounts of noise scattered throughout this. So I haven't found an exact use for it yet in like a practical example, but it's a cool texture, and I think I'll be using it in the future. There's also map range, which is something that I've wanted in Cycles or Eevee for a very long time, because it's in the Blender's compositor, but just hadn't made its way over to the material side of things. But what it does is it allows you to input a value and output like a different value. So let's say you're tweaking a shader node, and you're trying to get the difference between 0.0001 and let's actually just do this so I can show you what this does. So let's say you have something where the tiniest difference makes a big change. So let's say you have an input and a value, and you want to tweak something that's very finicky. Let's say just a texture, magic texture. For whatever reason, the distortion is very finicky, and you want it to be exactly between 0.5 and 0.5001. So a bit fictitious, but let's say you want to do that. Then you could have from minimum 0.5, from maximum of minimum 0, maximum 1, to minimum 0.5, to maximum 0.5001. So now you can plug in this value, and instead of tweaking those like tiny little numbers, you can just go between 0 and 1, and it'll give you that correct output. And I guess you could probably see this if we plug this into the base color or something. Or maybe if we plug this into the scale, you could see it, and plug that into a view. So you can see at a value of 0 over here, we're now outputting a value of 0.5. And at a value of 1, now we're outputting, it doesn't even go that low. We're now outputting a value of 0.51. So we can do a whole lot of change here and tweak very fine-tuned things. Or we could go the other way around. So let's say we go between 0 and 1, but we want -5 and maximum of 50. So we want to make really big moves. Then each one of these different small clicks will really like drastically change what this looks like. So I think that's a better, like more visual example. The master ingredient for Z-depth based fog in post. Yes, that was a great use for it, because it all like looked white and you had to like really fine tune those values. There's also a new clamp node, which is cool. So all of our color and like mix nodes have this clamp value, but some people said, hey, we want that outside of the mix node. We want just to have that in general, so we don't get values that are below 0 or higher than 1. Now you can just plug in this clamp node, and with any arbitrary mix minimum and maximum, you can clamp your values. So that's always handy to have. Again, probably not something you'd use all the time, but it's nice that it's there. Now for the improved stuff that was already there but got an update, thanks to Omar's Google Summer of Code, we have noise texture, which now has 4D. So now instead of just having our 3 dimensions here, we now have 1, 2, and 4 dimensions. So these are parameters that you're already familiar with. We can do 1-dimensional stuff if we want. 2-dimensional stuff, you can see it's kind of like stretched like a image texture would be. And we also have 4-dimensional. So it's like 3D, but there's an extra W parameter that you can kind of think of as like time if you want, or whatever arbitrary value. But you can see that as I move this, it kind of like warps along and gives us some really cool procedural effects. So this allows us to get some really interesting like change over time by keyframing this value. But again, it doesn't have to be just time. You can use it for anything you want. Similarly, Musgrave got the same treatment, where we now have this W value, so we can get this really cool like swirly type stuff. But there's also new Musgrave types, and they all have their own different settings. And actually, I believe these were already here, but they didn't have quite as many options. But this 4-dimensional addition to the node makes it much easier to make some cool like animated effects. We have mastered time itself. Yes, very true. The Voronoi also got an update. So not only does it also have the like 4D stuff now, but it also has a couple different options for different types of Voronoi and different outputs as well. So I couldn't tell you exactly what these different functions are like under the hood. I really don't know, but you can just kind of like visually see the difference, where F1 you have all these different cracks with the different points kind of like blending out between them. F2 is much more like crackly and has a much more like harsher transition. Smooth F1 is like F1 but without the cracks in between. Distance to edge is extremely crackly, very, very sharp. And it's just fun to play with these values here. And there's also a randomness slider, by the way, so you can actually bring this down and have a very evenly distributed texture, and that's interesting. You can adjust that value if you'd like. There's also end sphere radius, which is kind of just like the galvanized metal or kind of camo type stuff, where there's no gradient, there's no transition between these points, and their surrounding edges is just the color. But there's lots of different outputs here. We got the color, we got the position as well, so that's new. And also we have that W value. All right, now with the math node, it's about the same, but there's now a lot more options. So in case you were really into math and you worked with shader nodes, now we have a lot more stuff. So we've got round, floor, ceiling, fraction, modulo, a lot of different functions that can be helpful. To be honest, I have not used them yet. I've been going through November and trying to like make different shaders every day, but I have yet to like dig in deep enough to actually use some of these more complex math nodes. But what is cool about this is that the inputs are dynamic depending on what you choose. So most of these have, you know, 2 inputs, but if you choose something like sine or cosine, there's only 1 input, and so the other one will disappear. So if you happen to have something that's like connected to that second one and you choose sine, it's gonna disconnect it because there's no option for that. So it's just something to be aware of as you're like changing these nodes around. But it's very cool that we have new math functions. Mapping node has changed quite a bit. It got a little thinner, lost some pounds, and it's so much more useful now that you can actually plug stuff into the inputs here. So before it was very like square, and you had all these like location, rotation, and scale, but it was inside the node and you couldn't plug anything in. But now you can have any vector that you want, whether that's a texture coordinate or literally anything. You can plug that right into the location or rotation. You can use like vector math. So if you have a vector or converter, vector math, you can add 2 vectors together and then plug that in and then rotate the result of that. There's so much stuff that you can do here. So that just opens up the possibilities and allows for more customization. Awesome. Always good. The other thing that has been improved is vertex color. Before you had to like type in the exact name, and you can just choose it from a drop down. Pretty simple, pretty handy. Again, just a nice quality of life thing. Omer says lots of new stuff in 2.81. Yeah, glad you can make it. And yes, there is lots of new stuff. So we just went over some new nodes and improved nodes. Let's see, did I miss anything there? When it comes to shading, there's reduced artifacts for bump mapping in cycles. So I don't have a bump map example, but I guess we could, well, I don't want to render this out now. But if you want to check out the difference between that, I'll put that in the blog post. But Eevee does have improved bump mapping, and I already rendered out an example of that. So we can check that out, where if we look at it in the old version over here, so this is 2.80, and if we go to Eevee, we can see this has some pretty strong bump on it, but the bump actually isn't that strong in the node editor. In cycles, it's actually pretty normal. This is what it looks like in, whoa, that opened up really big. This is what it looks like in cycles. So pretty natural, pretty normal. In 2.80, the bump was pretty rough. You can definitely see like each individual like pixel. It's either like not anti-aliased or whatever. It's there, it works. It was just kind of like an initial implementation. But now in 2.81, we have much better bump mapping. So if we go to that same wood material, same setup and everything, you can now see this looks a heck of a lot better. So it's a lot closer to cycles than it was before. And still, you know, not quite the same quality as cycles because we're not getting the, ray traced samples. We can't average the values between, but we are getting a much better result. We can actually see the lines here a lot more clearly, and things overall are looking better. So that's definitely a really nice improvement because so many materials use bump mapping that it's really nice to have some improvements in that area. Bit of a random question, but do you know whether Eevee object deformation blur is coming anytime soon? It is coming at some point, but I don't actually know. It was part of the developer Ask Me Anything part of the Blender conference, but honestly, I don't remember what the answer was. It was that it is coming, but not immediately. Another question, when is 2.181 officially releasing? It was supposed to be released about a week from now, but they're thinking about kicking it another week down the road. So maybe 1 week, probably 2 weeks. All right, what else has been improved? So there's a denoise node, which I've already made a video about that's on YouTube if you want to go and look at that for a more like in-depth explanation. It's also on CG Cookie tutorial section. But if we go to compositing, we have this little node here, just called denoise. You can find it under filter and denoise, and it's using Intel's artificial intelligence, or I shouldn't use that word, machine learning is a better term for it, I guess. But it's machine learning based denoising, and so it's a lot different than the denoise that's over here under. Where is? Oh, it's because I'm in Eevee. If we switch over to cycles, let's render only like 2 samples, and we can go to our denoising under passes here. So this we leave off. In the comparison video that I did, it's the denoise node blows this out of the water basically every time. I couldn't find a single instance in which this was better than the node, even when animated. So I think this is probably just deprecated. It might be there for some very particular cases, but I would recommend just leaving this off. And the only thing that you need to check is under your passes, check denoising data, and that's going to supply some extra passes for you if you want. So now let's go ahead and render this. And 2 samples. If it looks good, I'll eat my hat. So 2 samples, and there we go. It doesn't look perfect, but it's pretty darn good for just those 2 samples. And that's with the normal and the denoising albedo plugged in. So you can see if we just look at that information, we get the normal map, we get the raw color, and for some reason it's not showing the wood texture in this. I'm not sure why. So let's try, like rendering with the diffuse color just to make sure, and make sure for our shading we don't have anything weird going on. That's just a regular principled BSDF, so I'm not sure why it's not getting that albedo texture, but if we just use the diffuse color instead, it's not as good, and I showed that in the other video, but it should still work reasonably well, and it'll clear up all that like blurry texture stuff. I said, well, dang, I'm gonna need to buy a new hat. Yeah, it's pretty good, and if we use this, let's see, diffuse color, you can see we get that raw texture data. If we plug that in, then it gets even better. So pretty darn nice. I think this is the first case where the denoising albedo isn't coming out how I would expect, and I'm not entirely sure why. But that is a topic for another day. There is the workaround if you need it. So super nice addition to 2.81. I'll definitely use that basically all the time when I'm using cycles. As far as EV improvements go, there are a few, actually quite a few under the hood ones, but some little more obvious ones as well. So soft shadows are easier. If you go under shadows, there's just less options because they've been optimized, and now the defaults just work a lot better. Sorry, that scroll bar in there was bugging me. So shadows have been simplified. The defaults are now just much better, and if you just click soft shadows, then things will work as you would expect. And let's actually get some lights in here. You see the difference? It just works. They're anti-aliased now, which is really nice, and overall just is better. I showed the better bump. I guess transparency has been improved, but I did some tests and I couldn't visually tell any difference. Maybe it's just faster or something. Similarly with volumes, those are allegedly faster, but I haven't done enough testing to actually be able to tell. And also now the holdout material works, so that is something pretty cool. So if we go to shading, and instead of using a principled BSDF, let's go to shader and holdout. Now we get something that would be transparent if we rendered it out. So I don't know whether we need transparent film or not. Let's check that on just in case. Yep, there we go. Now you can see the checkered transparent background is shown right through. So that's really nice for compositing and stuff. Yeah, very handy option. It just didn't work before, and now it does. So cool. That's always good when we bring EV kind of like closer to what we would expect from cycles, and works pretty well. Look at that beautiful viewport. EV will never not amaze me. Yeah, absolutely. Very true. It's just more fun to work with. You know, having a really nice looking viewport makes just arranging stuff and like laying out your scene, lighting and all that just more fun and enjoyable. And I think that makes a big difference in just the quality of work, because you can see and iterate faster, and it's awesome. I love it. One difference that I've been kind of skipping over is we switched around between solid and material and rendered view here at the top here, and these are the same options as you've seen before, but they are slightly different now. So we have solid view as normal, but this used to be called look dev view, but now it's just called material view. Now the reason for that is, well, it has exactly the same options as it did before, but now it's the same between EV and cycles. So if we go over to cycles here, we still have this material preview, and it works as it did before. However, if we go to EV, we now have a different rendered view in which we can, by default, scene lights and scene world are on, so you can switch between having the lights on or off, or using a different HDR if we want. But the cool thing here is that we can go over to cycles and now uncheck scene lights and scene world and use just any of these default preview things for our viewport render. So if we want to use a different HDR And hopefully rendering doesn't cause the stream to jump. Let me know if that happens. But we can just choose these different HDRIs and use those here. And if we want to render using this, you can do a viewport render if you want to view viewport render image. And there you go. Is it killing my computer? Let me check that the stream is still seems to be going. But there's also another option for cycles rendered view for render passes. So now we can just look at one pass at a time. So if you want to make, like, for example, a really quick clay render, instead of using combined, you can just go to ambient occlusion. Let's render that out with a couple samples, and there we go. Though if we do a viewport render, it's not going to do all the compositing stuff, so you can't use the denoise node unless you like plug it in after the fact. But this is a really quick way to just get different effects or preview, for example, what's glossy in the scene. Well, now you can just kind of check it out. And if you're curious about like what is, ooh, I wonder what the indirect would look like. Let's look at diffuse indirect. It's kind of fun just to check out and see what's bouncing around in the scene, what's going on, what's actually influencing what, like what lights are hitting what indirectly. I can see a lot of different, like, if you really want to get very picky with your lighting, this is something that you could use pretty frequently. However, for the most part, probably best to leave it on combined. Question: they have fixed Eevee with procedural textures. I found things like noise and math didn't seem to work in the past. Yeah, true. They just didn't work as well. I still run into few things with Eevee and textures where it's just not quite as I expect. It's a lot closer to cycles now, though. So as I've been like working through November and trying to make different shaders, I've used cycles every single day. Because of that, I found that I like just couldn't get the same result in Eevee. But it is a whole lot closer now. Next up, library overrides. So this is a super cool one. Let's go back to solid view here. And let's just make a new scene. And this is for like animation production type stuff. So let's say we had a different file. Let's say we wanted to link something from a different file. So let's see, I'll just link from this other example file that I had that's pretty much the exact same as this file, but slightly different. If we go to link and we go to collection, I have a collection with the robot character. So let's select that and click link. Okay, so we have this character here. We have a linked collection. And if I change something in the original file, it's going to change it here. So that's the beauty of linking, is that you can use one asset throughout multiple blend files, and if you just change the one file, that change will propagate through everything else. So that's super nice, really great workflow. However, before we had proxies and things got a little bit rough. So I'll show you how to make the proxy the original way. You know, because we have this linked asset, we can move it around, scale it up and down and stuff, but we can't actually change the pose or animate it in any way, and so it's not as useful. So if we go to object and relations and make proxy, we can go to our robot rig control, and here we go. So now we can actually go through and take this proxy rig, go to pose mode, and move this around. We can now pose our object. Okay, so that's pretty cool. But there were a few different things that were just kind of weird about it. They fixed the thing where it would like double draw. In 2.80, you'd have this like double draw effect where the proxy would be drawn on top of the original rig, and that was kind of weird. Just some odd things going on. So that has been improved. But there's just things that you can't change. So, for example, let me find. So I think everything with the proxy rig can change, but we can't change. Let's see. Let's make a proxy for our character mesh. Object relations. Make proxy robot geo. Here we go. So now we have now we have both. So we have the old geometry plus the new one. But you can't change any of the shader settings, for example, because that's linked from the original file, and it's just completely disabled. You can't really change it. You can't go into edit mode, any of that type of stuff. You can add new modifiers if you want, but there's just a very select few things that you can do with these proxies and whatever, and it creates that like duplicate and stuff, and it gets a little bit weird. So let me actually undo that and just let's go ahead and delete the proxies. So we just have our character link here. But instead of creating a proxy, I'm going to create an override. I think the robot looks really cool, by the way. Oh, thanks, Jen. Well, credit goes to Kent. He is the one who modeled and textured it. But I've been kind of using it a lot because a new first-person shooter course is coming out very, very soon. And it uses this guy from a first-person perspective. So, but the credit for making the robot look cool entirely goes to Kent, because he did a really good job. And also Tim did the concept art for it like 3 years ago. So it's kind of been a long time in the making and been used for quite a lot of stuff. But yeah, instead of using that like awkward proxy system, which had a lot of frustrations with it, if we go to object and relations, we can make library override. So now if we go ahead and make an override for the control rig, then instead of duplicating it, we can now override some of those settings. So let's hide that little character empty and enable the shading, or enable it in the viewport. Again, for proxies, if you had a proxy of something, you couldn't enable or disable whether it was shown in the viewport or not. So another one of those like frustrating things. But now with this character collection, we now have access to all of these different objects inside of here, and we can toggle whether or not they're viewed, which is super cool. We can use the checkbox, whatever. We can look at the control rig. We can take this into pose mode, pose the character. Nothing's being duplicated or like drawn on top of other stuff, so that's really nice. And we can just go ahead and change a lot more things. If we wanted to, we could make things local if we want. So for example, here we have this little icon here. So it's a linked data block, click to make fully local. And if we do this, then instead of having it be linked, it'll be as if it's appended. Now, the really cool thing about linked overrides, or library overrides, I guess, as they're technically called, is the fact that you can change a few things and still have everything else be linked. So it'll override certain properties, but not everything else. So let me see if I can find a good example here. I think the material, I don't think I can do anything with that. And this is something that's going to be improved more in the future. So this is still like very early on, but all the basic stuff is here. So we have this modifier, but for example, we could remap the modifier to something else. So instead of using the third deformation rig, we can assign it to something else, and it'll just override that particular property. Now, as this feature gets more and more developed, then more of these things will be able to be overridden, and so that's pretty awesome. Useful for palette swapping linked objects, I bet. Yes. Looking forward to the FPS course. Probably won't run through it completely, but I look forward to amending the final result, or appending the final result. Sweet. Yeah, I do whatever you want with it. I think hopefully you can have some fun. Throw it into Unity, whatever you want to do. Hopefully it'll be some entertainment. So linked overrides. I think that's something that we have a course transitioning from 2.79 to 2.8. And that does cover overrides a little bit, I believe, and also covers the frustrations of working with proxies, because proxies will still be around for the foreseeable future until overrides are like totally complete, which will probably be a few releases from now. So they're just now implemented, and it'll be a bit before they're totally inside of Blender. But it's very nice already to work with. Oh, the other big thing about overrides, which I completely forgot to mention, is that you can now have one linked asset duplicated multiple times throughout the scene. So before, when you had a proxy, you could only have one proxy of something. Now I'm pretty sure, yep, we can just go ahead and duplicate this collection. And let's see, let's take this control rig, move that over here. We can animate this character doing two different things. And before with proxies, this was just not possible. So we can have, you know, three robots all animated differently, all in the same scene. But it's all linked to the original geometry. And if I, you know, changed a texture or something in that original file, it would change all three of, or two of, in this case, characters in the scene. So really, really helpful and very necessary for animation. The rest of the other things are that are new in 2.81 are things that I honestly don't really use all that often, but we can go ahead and look at them. So one of them is, I guess I didn't save the file before I started it, but is with the grease pencil. So there's a lot of grease pencil updates. Frankly, I don't really use it except for just super basic stuff, but there is some cool things that I think are worth looking at. So we got a new grease pencil object, for example, a stroke. The first thing that I think is cool, if we go to draw mode here, is that it works a lot better with overlapping materials. So let me just scale up my brush here and say I draw here. You'll notice that we have a solid flat color, and I guess it's kind of hard to see when it's all black like that. If we go to materials and let's draw with a white material, or let's go green. Let's have some fun. So now you can see that it's actually just solid green. And if I draw on top of that, you know, then it'll overlap. But as I'm drawing the same stroke, it's not going to overlap, and I can kind of like fill in this area, whatever I want to do, and it all works pretty well. Now, if I check self-overlap, you can see we get what we had in 2.80. There was no option to turn this off. It would look pretty darn messy, but once you check this on, that all goes away, and it looks like a nice smooth stroke. So one of those tiny little options that is on by default now and just looks a heck of a lot better. Yeah, it just looked pretty weird before. There's also another thing that's pretty cool in Grease Pencil. If we have lots of different Grease Pencil objects, let's add a monkey here. And let's also add some mesh objects. Let's add a sphere. Okay, so say we have all these different objects, and we're working on this one Grease Pencil object in draw mode, and we find everything else just very distracting. Then what we can do is go to the overlays and turn on fade objects. So that's going to fade away all of our mesh objects, and so we're just less distracted by them. If we go to like 0.25, that's pretty good. We can still see them, but they're not as distracting. Now, maybe it would be kind of nice if it went to white, if there's not like an option, in case we're using like really dark strokes, but whatever. That is pretty sweet. Or maybe that has to do with the viewport background. Let me see. Maybe it uses the viewport background color? Yeah, it does. That's cool. So if we have the viewport background set to white and we fade this, then it'll fade to white. Super cool. That's really awesome. But you can also enable this for other Grease Pencil objects. So if you click that on the right, then it's going to fade everything that you're not working on at the moment. Everything else will be nice and crisp, but the Grease Pencil that you're working on will be, or everything else will be faded, and you won't be distracted by it. In addition to that, there's a new modifier for simplifying strokes. So for example, if we look at this in wireframe view or in edit mode, we can see that there's quite a lot of points here, and maybe we don't need all of those points. Maybe we drew something really, really big and, you know, just is way too complex, and we don't need all that. Well, we can go to the modifiers here, and we have a simplify, and we had this before, but there's a few different options for it now, where you can set the iterations to how much it simplifies. First, it just sets a fixed distance, or a fixed like maximum distance, or minimum, whichever. And then adaptive is quite nice. So it'll reduce it less on areas where it's less curved. So the more detailed something needs to be, the more vertices it'll have. So that's probably best for most things. But there's also merge by distance. So your classic edit mode merge by distance, it can now use that. And that's now a new operator inside of edit mode as well. So not just in the modifier, but if we go to edit mode, and actually I haven't tried this yet, but I'm gonna guess that if we right click and go to merge by distance, yep, there we go. We can increase the threshold, and just like we would merge vertices in edit mode for mesh objects, we can do the same thing with grease pencil objects. So pretty sweet, and just makes it easier to work with. Let's see, we can also now convert curves to strokes. So if we go to curved and just add a Bezier circle, convert to grease pencil from curve, and there we go. Now we can go to draw mode and do whatever we want with it. Erase it, draw more on top of it, whatever. We now have a curve from a stroke. And there's different like options for it if you want it to be thicker, thinner, anything you want to do. Beyond that, there are new brushes and presets. So in case you are in, let's see, draw mode, and you want to look at your different brushes here, there's quite a few new ones, and the defaults are now much better. So you can have some cool like ink effects. Again, you can kind of tell that I'm not a grease pencil aficionado here, but I think I might become one after playing around with this like ink pen, just because it just looks so natural, looks super cool, and now that it's not like overlapping with itself all the time, I can see myself really getting into sketching in this, and just kind of like doing a lot more concepting straight in Blender itself. So new brushes, all that stuff, and also improved guides, but that's not something I've really used before. So I couldn't really tell you about that. Icons look like Krita's icons? Yeah, they do. And they're pretty descriptive, tell you what they do. Use markers, hard markers. Yeah, very fun. Let's uncheck fade. There we go. So I think, yeah, I'll have to play around with grease pencil more in the future because it's so cool, but I also, yeah, I just don't use that part of Blender all that much. Also don't do a lot of concepting anyway, but very cool. Last couple things that I just want to mention here. The video sequencer now is faster. I don't really use the video sequencer, to be honest. I use Premiere Pro for all my video editing, but if you did use the video sequence editor, now it'll prefetch frames. So instead of rendering like only like a couple frames before it, it'll actually like pre-render, and then as you hit play, it'll play back much smoother. So that's a nice addition. There's apparently more sequencer things that are going to be improved in the future. So if you are a sequencer fan, then there is more in store for you there. Also, the other thing that's like not built into Blender, but Rigify got an update in this particular Blender version, and now it's just faster to generate the rig. So apparently it was a little bit slow before, but now if you, I don't even know if I have it enabled. Oh, I do. If you use a human rig here, and you go to the generate rig, then it should be quite a bit faster. I didn't really change anything there. Oh, I think it's if you only if you don't use the face rig. And I don't really use Rigify either, so I couldn't tell you how to not use the face rig. Maybe there's an option for when you create it. No, I don't see one. Let's see, what's the yeah, I don't think we get any options for that. Maybe basic human. Yeah, there we go. Now if you just use a basic human without the face rig, then it's pretty much instantaneous, which is very cool. So try it again, and boom, done. way faster than it was before. But if you use the default one with the face rig, it's still kind of slow. Jen said, to be honest, most recently I used grease pencil, not for drawing, but it was great for making notes on my friend's animation. Yeah, I think that's a great use for it. And honestly, that's also what I tend to use it for, is on people's models as well. Since you could draw right on the surface, you can kind of like circle stuff and say like, oh, you might need to fix this or whatever. It's really nice for just taking notes in the viewport, which I guess the annotate tool is perfect for. Apparently the stream dropped out a little bit. Sorry about that. Hopefully my internet hasn't been going to crap. Ooh, yeah, it is very low resolution now. Well, I guess the plus side here is that we went through basically all of the features of 2.81. If you want to watch this later, the recording will be the high quality version because it's recorded from my computer, so it won't have any like of the internet issues. Hopefully that will be better if you want to check out the end. But that's basically it. If you want to see the release notes, I've put those down below and you can go through literally everything, all of the minor fixes and stuff. But these are all the things that will actually change or potentially change your workflow and that you might want to be aware of. Really the only like massive ones are outliner, file browser, remesher, and a few of the like sculpting stuff if you're into that. So thanks for tuning in, guys. I hope you learned some new stuff about Blender as it's coming up. Again, it should be released in a week or two, so be on the lookout for that. And also check out Kent's stream that he's doing next week, and then Wayne also posted a stream that he'll be doing, I believe 2 weeks from now, about rigging. So if you're interested in that, be sure to check that out. And then also I'll probably do a November recap at some point, because I just found that there's like so many really cool materials being created that blow my mind that I'm like, I have no idea how this was made. For example, the tornado stuff, like I tried really hard to like shape a tornado out of a shader, and I think I did like an okay job, but like it definitely wasn't where I wanted it to be. And then people just posted exactly what I had tried to get, but like failed to do. And was like, oh, wow. So there's lots of like tricks that can be learned, and people are posting their node setups and stuff. So I want to like take some time to like deconstruct those and show the coolest ones and how to get there. So be on the lookout for new stuff coming up. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.